All right, here we are. Take number 3 on the wrap up for criminal law. So, the goal of criminal law, in an economic sense, is to minimize. Okay, where is my pencil? Here we go. Minimize social cost of crime. So, to minimize the social cost of crime, there are two main aspects of the social cost of crime. One is the net loss in value due to crime. And the second is the cost to potential victims of crime avoidance. So, the net loss in value due to crime, if someone breaks your car window in order to take an iPhone out of your car that was laying on the passenger seat, let's say the iPhone is worth $200, and they break your window. To get to it, it costs you $350 to replace your window. Then what's the net loss in value due to crime? Well, there's the you lose a phone worth $200 and you sustain $350 worth of damage to your car. But if the criminal gains your phone, which is worth $200, so the net loss, switch colors here, the net loss in value due to crime is really the $350 of damage to your windshield, or the side window, whatever they broke to get in. That's part of the net loss in value. Now that requires that you count the value of the good to the criminal, and that's not without controversy. From an economic sense, from an economic standpoint at least, it does make some sense much of the time. But it's not, like I said, it's not without controversy. It's especially troubling, and it's troubling for me in situations of crimes against people. So you think murder or rape or some other violent and horrific imposition on someone else. To the extent that the criminal is some sort of a psychopath who takes pleasure in doing this to someone else. If you're a serial murderer, if you're a rapist, something that to the extent that the person committing the act takes pleasure in that, and should you count that in terms of the should you offset the incredible harm that this imposes on someone else by that? That's tough, right? That's controversial. But when it comes to stealing the phone out of your car, not such a big deal. To at least to count the value of it. I shouldn't say not a big deal. Not to count the value of it to the criminal as well. The other issue is what if the thief, right? What if the criminal who took it actually values something more than the person that it was taken from? Could you have socially efficient crime? In the Landsberg chapter that I gave you, they talk a little bit about if it's more valuable to the thief than to the to the victim, then enforcing private property rights and preventing that crime will allow the transaction to take place. That is, that the person who values it more just buys it from the outbids the person who already has it. But the counting the value to the criminal does allow for situations where you have a Robin Hood sort of thief that steals from the rich and gives to the poor, and where maybe the marginal benefit of $50 to a homeless person might be greater than the marginal benefit of those $50 stolen from a very wealthy person. And so do you set up a scenario where you can actually justify crime by thinking about that difference in marginal benefits? That is also problematic in terms of the incentives that creates. Right? Generally speaking, a system that enforces private property rights and prohibits crime, prohibits theft, is generally going to create better incentives and be more efficient than one that condones it. So, at any rate, that's a couple of thoughts on the net loss. The other aspect of this is the cost to to potential victims, to regular citizens, of trying to avoid crime. So, this could include security systems. That says security systems. Maybe that's not totally clear. Bars on windows. In cities they have those roll-up doors over the businesses, but you can't even read that, can you? That says bars on windows. Let's try again. Bars on. And then you also have the cost of police force, criminal or the justice system, the court system that administers it. Those are all costs as well to potential victims of crime. So the social cost of crime is both. It's both the loss that's created by the crime itself, that's here, and it's the cost of trying to avoid crime. You want to, from an economic standpoint, you want to minimize the cost on society from crime and crime avoidance. So one of the implications of that is that the optimal level of criminal deterrence is not 100% deterrence of crime or reduction in crime. And a simple marginal cost, marginal benefit graph can help us see that. So if on the vertical axis we think about costs and benefits, I'm not sure why that got smaller. Costs and benefits, and on the horizontal axis we look at the percent reduction in crime. You get a fairly straightforward marginal benefit, marginal cost graph, where the marginal social benefit of reducing crime is downward sloping, that is, it's declining. The value to society of eliminating murder and rape and some very serious crimes against people is huge. Right? The value to society and of reducing theft is also very big. So there's a very, let me change colors here. There's a very high benefit, right? A very large benefit to initial reduction in crime, some of the worst, most heinous crimes. Then as you increase your reduction in crime, there's still benefits to society. Right? If crime is bad, then reducing crime has benefits to society, but maybe they're not as great as the deterrence of murder. And down here somewhere, there are smaller crimes, libel, slander. Right? We can prosecute those, but is that a society? What is the gain to society? It's positive, but maybe it's not as huge. I don't know, jaywalking, speeding, other sorts of crimes. Preventing them, is good for society, but the marginal benefit of them is much less than some of those other areas we had just talked about. So I'm just trying to clean this up a little. So you had a declining marginal social benefit from crime, but of course the marginal social cost of deterring it is increasing. Right? So marginal social cost is increasing. If you want to cut out some crime, you can do that with a lean police force and adjudication. The more you want to reduce crime, the more you have to invest in more officers, on the beat, more detectives, more fancy crime lab equipment like you see in CSI, right, or somewhere else. And so the economists would say you should pursue something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, and that then you should stop. And so somewhere in here, there's Q star, right? There's an optimal level of crime reduction, which means, or deterrence of crime, which means that still allows for some crime to happen. So that optimal level of crime then is still positive. And that's the part that might be surprising. If we say that crime is bad, then how is it that the optimal level of crime, could be positive? Well, that's because the cost of reducing crime is also positive. So to the extent that there is a cost to deterring or reducing crime, then it's very possible that the optimal level of crime will still be positive. And so this suggests, excuse me, that this might be one way of thinking about how much to invest in reduction of crime, deterrence of crime. And if any of these things change, if the marginal social benefit or the marginal social cost of deterring crime changes, then the optimal level of deterrence or reduction in crime would change. So, for example, if for one reason or another the marginal social benefit of deterring crime were to increase, right, so we'll call this the marginal benefit curve 2, right? So if there were an increase in the benefit to society of reducing crime, then we would expect ultimately they will incur more costs and have a higher level of crime reduction, right? Criminal deterrence. And the same thing would happen if the social cost changed. If the social cost of decreasing crime, deterring crime changed, then that would shift the new sort of equilibrium, right? The new point where the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit are equal. I want to pause and ask if there's any questions, but if there are questions, you'll have to email me. Right? Shoot me an email. We can talk on the phone. We can Zoom. Next up, optimal punishment. This brings up a question about fines versus incarceration. These are two different ways that we can deter crime. You can deter it through charging fines. You can do it through putting people in prison. Now, one of the interesting things here is that fines are money that's paid to the government, right? So in civil law and torts, if you're found liable in tort, you pay money damages, and that goes to the victim, right? The plaintiff in the lawsuit. But if you are in criminal court and the prosecutor makes his case and you are fined, that is money that is paid to the government. And that's interesting because incarceration, right? When we put people in jail, there is a significant cost to the government, cost to society to incarcerate. And because of that, is it the case that fines are a better, right, a more optimal way of punishing? Well, yes and no. I mean, one, financial aid, there's a certain advantage to this, but fines are, they have some real drawbacks as well. And one of the main problems with fines is that of what we call judgment-proof defendants. So when we say judgment-proof, we just mean that they're poor, right? That they don't have a lot of assets. And so even if you get a judgment against them, so, in the court of law, they may not be able to pay. Excuse me. So if so that's a judgment-proof defendant. So basically, if you don't have very many assets, if you don't have much, then the government can't squeeze, fine money out of you. You might be ordered to pay it, but if you can't pay it, you can't pay it. And ultimately, what happens then is that you get thrown in jail. Right? That's sort of the consequence. But that's one of the cases where fines don't work as well. There are also questions about sort of the opposite end of the extreme, very wealthy. I don't know why I put a Y in here. Sorry. Wealthy. Very wealthy defendants. Are they affected by fines in the same way that average, man on the street is? That's a great question. So some people say that fines should be on a sliding scale and depend on your income. The economic argument actually suggests that the fines should be equal to the externality that's created by the bad action, in which case it doesn't vary based on whether you're rich or poor. But it is the case in terms of deterrence it is the case that a fine of a fixed value might have a very different effect on someone of very modest means than someone who's fabulously wealthy, and that's an interesting question. I mean, that comes up with traffic violations, right? You get a speeding ticket, you have to pay a fine. You don't usually get thrown in jail for a speeding ticket, but that fine, it could be several $100s. Let's say it's $300 fine. That's a lot of money for many of us. Now, not for me, $300 is a lot of money, but it wouldn't be the difference between making the mortgage payment or not, right? If I got a traffic fine, for some people it might be, but for someone who's fabulously wealthy, that it might be nearly nothing. So interestingly, with traffic laws, you also get points. You get a fine for speeding. You also get points. You accumulate too many points, you can lose your license. So that would be an example of tying fines with something else that does in fact sting, right? Whether you're rich or poor, that is a problem. So fines versus incarceration. The other thing that plays into this is, I was scrolling down, I couldn't remember if I put a heading in for that. The other thing that plays into this is thinking about the effective punishment. And this is like the expected value. The effective punishment, right, or the expected value, is really the probability of getting caught and convicted, right? So we'll call it probability of punishment times the magnitude of punishment. So you have the probability and the magnitude. You multiply them together, you get the expected value. So that is interesting because you can affect the probability and the magnitude at different costs, right? So if you, let's pick a bright color here. The probability of punishment, well, this depends on the number of police officers out there. Okay. Well, that's nice and big. The number of police officers that are out there, how the standard of proof that you need to prove it. Then the magnitude of the punishment, that's just how big is the fine or how long are you thrown in jail. Okay? And so you put those together to get the expected value, just like we talked about flipping a coin. $100 for heads, 0 for tails. What's the expected value? Well, with a fair coin, the expected value is $50, even though no one ever gets $50 right from that particular flip. So it's cheaper to increase the magnitude of the punishment than it is to increase the probability of the punishment, right? Increasing the probability might require more policing, more technology, right? More cameras, more whatever it is. So increasing the probability, this can be expensive, right? Or at least costly. Increasing the magnitude, this is actually a little easier. So is there any difference between a 10% chance? So what if the probability of getting, if you're speeding, let's say the probability is 10%, and then you'll have to pay, if you get caught, a $300 fine. Then the expected cost of speeding is $30, right? Because one time out of 10 you'll get fined $300. But what if we just decreased the likelihood? No, we didn't pay so many cops, we didn't have as many out there, so there was only a 1% chance that you got caught, but we just increased the fine to $3,000, and then the expected value is the same. So this Friedman talks about in that chapter I posted for you under the section just hang them all. Because the problem with this line of thinking is that, one, that this value gets so big that you can have judgment-proof defendants, right? In the sense that nobody could, or some people would not be able to pay it. And two, as anytime you use this argument, there's always you can always go farther, right? Well, then what if you made this, I guess it would be 0.1%, right? What if we made this 0.1%, right? 1/10 of 1%, and then we just made the fine $30,000. You get the same expected value. But then why stop at 1/10 of 1%? You could do 100th of a percent. Right? There's always this argument that you just make this smaller and this bigger and get the same expected value. So it's sort of a, I don't know if it's a slippery slope, but it's sort of this, if you go down that road, then you can always improve on it with then you just make it the death penalty, so hang someone for speeding with a tiny probability of getting caught. And that may not be, when you think about marginal deterrence and marginal incentives, that may not be the appropriate way to go. On top of that, there was one other problem, and that has to do with behavioral econ, which is the intersection of psychology and economics. And some people suggest that when people are dealing with very, very small probabilities and very, very big magnitude harms, so smaller than this, right? A tiny probability and then a really, really massive bad outcome, that we don't properly assess those and we don't properly act on them in the way that a rational maximizing Homo economicus would, right? So if neoclassical standard economic theory says people are rational thinkers and they're making these calculations, the behavioral challenge to that is, well, some studies suggest that people don't always make those trade-offs exactly accurately. So that would be another problem with following this line of thinking, where we could decrease cost by just increasing the magnitude and decreasing the probability. So the last thing I wanted to talk about to wrap up this section is the idea of criminal intent. And this can be summed up in the Latin mens rea, right? Which is Latin for, as I understand it, for a guilty mind, right? So there are certain crimes that are crimes of intent. They require mens rea, right? They require criminal intent. So for murder, for example, murder is a criminal intent crime. Manslaughter is not. So you can commit manslaughter without intending to kill anyone. You could be, completely reckless, right, and do something really stupid, and if someone dies as a result of it, you may be guilty of manslaughter. But you're not guilty of murder unless you intended to do that, or at least murder one, or like the right classification. So that's where this comes in, this idea of intent. There are certain crimes that require intent as one of the elements to prove them. There are other crimes that don't. The other interesting thing that comes into play here has to do with corporations. And I just find this area of law, I'm not an expert in this, but I think it's fascinating. Is a corporation a person? Well, yes and no, right? It's situational. In some cases we say they are, in some cases we say they aren't. There's not necessarily a grand sort of united theory about this. So in Citizens United, right, a relatively recent Supreme Court case, for purposes of political contributions, they treat corporations as persons. In some other contexts, corporations are not persons. So is a corporation a person to the extent that they can commit a crime of intent? I think the answer to that is generally no. Corporations can commit torts, right? So they can commit torts. That is, they can be, the actions of a corporation can meet the elements of tort, and they could be liable for damages. But then, can they commit a crime of intent? I think the answer there is that they can't. Now, there are strict liability crimes where if you undertake this action, then you're automatically liable of the crime, right? And so that they could be liable for. But I just think one, just be aware that there are crimes of intent, and I think this is an interesting question, that pervades other areas of law as well. So there you go. Finally, the conclusion of our section on criminal law. If you have questions, shoot me an email. follow up, we can chat. You can chat next Thursday at class time, at 9:30 on Zoom as well, and certainly we can find other times to chat. But at any rate, that's it for this particular session. I'm going to get this uploaded, and then next we move into intellectual property. So you guys all